Welcome to session 78 of Worlds of Speculative Fiction. The two works that we're going to be looking at today are both recent by a fairly local author. He's located just south of here in Chicago. His name is James Kennedy. We have Dare to Know, which is an earlier book from 2021. And then we have the very, very recent 2023 Bride of the Tornado. Now, this is going to be a kind of unusual session in several different respects. Before I tell you about that, though, I want to, for anybody who's new to this, just give you a brief rundown of what we've got going on here. So Worlds of Speculative Fiction began in 2016 as an in-person session hosted by the Brookfield Public Library locally here in the greater Milwaukee area. And we recorded the sessions. You can see all of the previous sessions. They're available to you in a playlist. And we also actually have an online course to support it. And, you know, world building, speculative fiction, so fantasy, sci-fi, horror, weird, alternate history, all sorts of other things, philosophical fiction, humorous ways of doing fantasy and sci-fi and other things as well, and all sorts of matters in between. We focus on the world building across stories, so a narrative universe, and we focus on philosophical themes. No big surprise, since I am a philosopher by training and trade. So we did that as an in-person thing until COVID hit. We took a little break for a while, and now we've been doing it this way since 2020. So we have a video premiere with live chat where you can interact and say what you want to say and ask questions and all of that sort of thing. And then after that, we follow it up with a Zoom video conferencing session for those who would like to continue the conversation. The video premiere will be anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes because we really go into depth with the works that we're looking at. There's a lot to say. And frankly, I'll mention that just with these two works, we kind of just scratched the surface. Now, how is this one unusual? It's not often that I look at works by an author who I know personally and have interacted with on multiple occasions and can say I'm friends with. But that is the case with James Kennedy. And so, you know, these are signed copies. You know, there's inscriptions and actually a kind of cool stamp inside. This one to Greg and Andy, and then Bride of the Tornado. I'm so thankful and happy we've become friends. I hope you enjoy this one too, you know, again with the stamp. So, you know, I asked at one of the places, one of the book signings and readings, where James came in, actually the one where he dressed up like a tornado. It's very cool. You should Google it online. Are these part of a shared narrative universe? And he thought about it a bit, and he's like, well, yeah, actually they are. As we're going to see, there's some major philosophical themes in common between the books as well, which, you know, stems from James being a thoughtful, omnivorous reader and ruminator on matters, literary, philosophical. All of that will come to light soon. And so he said, yeah, actually it is. And so I said, well, then we can do this in Worlds of Speculative Fiction, and that is what we're doing right now. There's two other ways in which this session is a little bit unusual. So I've already recorded all the other portions of this session, and in order to not make it go too long, in part because if all things go according to plan, James is going to join us for the Zoom, and we'll talk with him afterwards about, what he thinks about his works, and people can ask him questions. I'm not going to do biography, other than to mention that he's written other books besides this. Google him. He does a lot of different things, but he's written a young adult book, The Order of Oddfish, another great one. Not really in this narrative universe, so we're not talking about that there, but you can ask him questions. He's a very personable author, easy to get in touch with. Now, the second way that this is really quite different, James and I did a video interview as part of what you're going to be watching shortly. I took clips from it and wove them in with my own, talking about what's going on and readings from these works. Now, why did I do that? Who better to tell us about the author and what was on his mind and what he thinks about things than the author himself? So it's very rare that we get that sort of opportunity. Many of the people that we do these sessions on are long dead, not easy to get in touch with among the living. And so having the opportunity to do this is a real treat. I hope that you enjoy it. And so with no further ado, we're actually going to jump right into the dialogue between James and I. And you'll see me come on just by myself a little bit later on. So that's it. Sit back. We got a lot coming at you for roughly the next, 80, 90 minutes or so. And then we're going to have a great discussion afterwards. Both of these books are really straddling genres within speculative fiction. And in the title for this session, I called it, James Kennedy's Weird Universe, because weird is a nice catch-all category, but it does really fit. And I think that, you could say that certainly Bride of the Tornado has some fantasy elements to it. Dare to Know, definitely not just detective, but also sci-fi elements to it. Horror, I think, in both of them. So when somebody asks you, okay, what kind of book do you have here? What do you actually say to them? Are you able to locate it within a genre, or both of them within a genre?
I mean, I think what you said, just weird, is great. Like, hopefully that can become a genre because, when you go to a bookstore or whatever, like Dare to Know tends to get shelved as sci-fi, and
Okay.
Bride of the Tornado tends to get shelved as horror. And to be sure, in terms of marketing, that's the best way to sell books. The closest genre to what you've done and stick it there. But
Yeah.
I think often folks who come looking for the usual genre pleasures to those books of sci-fi and horror might come away from my books a little puzzled or disappointed or surprised. And I'm sorry to them, but I have their money now. But hopefully the unexpected thing that they get is something that's kind of a bit of a nice surprise. So I don't know what I call. But I think like the writers that I really admire are the ones who kind of straddle things. Or like what would you call Kelly Link? Like she's one of my favorite writers, and she writes these extremely weird short stories, and you can't call them fantasy, really. You definitely can't call them science fiction, or like China Miéville, like his
Yeah, yeah.
stuff. When I think about like The City and the City, what is that? Is that science fiction? No. Is it fantasy? No. It's just weird. I think, what I think if you're sitting somewhere in which there's more than one genre pulling you in different directions, you're doing something idiosyncratic, I think you're in a good place. Now, the people who might read like 500 science fiction novels a year and say, oh, here's another one, and they want just more grist for the mill, they might stumble on this spiky thing. But
Yeah.
that's the chance you have to take.
One of the questions I was going to ask you about that I think, every author probably gets is, okay, so who are the authors you've been influenced by, and how do those influences come out in your writing? And it's interesting that you said, I'm not doing that. thing that Chesterton is doing, because sometimes the influence isn't, well, I'm going to copy somebody, I'm going to follow exactly in their footsteps. It's more emulative, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, you can never, I mean, it's what was Bloom's idea of like the anxiety of influence. You can try to if you copy somebody and you do a good job, then you're doing a bad job. Like the
Yeah,
thing
yeah.
that makes you good is that your creative misreading of your master. You're doing violence to the master by uh, taking what they did and doing something else with it. Let me put it this way. There's a novelist that I loved when I was a kid and still love, Madeline L'Engle, right? A
Oh,
Wrinkle in
yeah.
There's a great scene in A Wrinkle in Time that in which they're trying to explain hyperspace, right? And they have a bug and it's on a string, and the bug can march all the way across the string. But if you bring the two parts of the string together, the bug can just hop from one to the other, and they're explaining, and that's what the world is really like. Uh, um, so in my first novel, this young adult fantasy, The Order of Oddfish, I write a scene that is a creative misreading of that scene.
Okay.
In which they say, well, where is this fantasy world? And they're like, oh, well, like, take a piece of paper and crumple it up, or take a map and you crumple it up, and then when you crumple it up, you see, and the main character saw the globe of our world on it. Say, oh, but if you uncrumple it, you see all these hidden places coming out. It's like, oh, is that the way the world really is? And they're like, no, but it makes for a fun, basically she's initiated in this group of knights, like scholar knights, and they're like the Order of Oddfish is like, as an oddfish, it's not my job to be right, it's my job to be wrong in new and exciting ways, which I think is what a lot of like academic intellectualism is kind of like. Sometimes like you want to find a way to be wrong in a new and exciting way, you want to misread your predecessors in a new and exciting way. And so
Yeah.
that's what me misreading Lengel in that way is kind of doing her scene, but doing it again my way, and kind of undermining like her like metaphysical certainty. It's saying, I'm going to make this elaborate thing. I'm going to say, and I don't even know if it's true.
Yeah.
So like I could never write a Madeline L'Engle book, but she's going to influence me, and I'm going to creatively misread her.
Are there any other authors who come like directly to mind? We mentioned Chesterton, Langle.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess it comes from like historical thing. Like when you're a kid, like I read Madeline L'Engle, and I think the reason that she was interesting is that she had an argument to make, like
Right.
Chesterton.
Yeah.
And he was not afraid to be metaphysical. And to my raised Catholic mind, metaphysics was natural. Like it wasn't weird to talk about such things. And then I really liked Dahl because he was
Oh,
funny and
yeah.
actually funny. Not
Yeah.
something that people say was funny for kids, but something that was actually funny and felt subversive and felt like, I don't know if the adults would like me reading this.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
which is like, and then I graduated from that to like Douglas Adams. And in Dare to Know, there's a point at which the main character is talking about some science fiction writer that he really liked, but his roommate, didn't really like Renard, and it's Douglas Adams that I'm referring to. Um,
Okay.
and who like an Englishman who wrote a handful of funny sci-fi books, but then but his like offhand predict like jokes ended up being better predictions of the future than like the labors of futurists. Like he kind of predicted, Wikipedia and like the
Yep.
internet and AI and all in ways that are like more cogent than like how people actually were predicting it. His jokes were more accurate. So what I liked about him is that there's an idea on every page, it feels like. By slipping into that narrator mode of the guide speaking, he
Yeah.
could just
Yeah.
throw in one idea after another, and he didn't have to write too many scenes of people walking into a room, putting down a glass of water and saying something about their emotions. Like he could just do bits. I was like, oh, you can just do bits. And you can like stuff a book with more ideas than I thought you could. And so in junior high, like I kind of graduated to like Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, who I liked because I especially like the short stories because it was like one nugget of an
Okay.
idea.
Yeah.
Almost
Yeah.
like you can
Yeah.
tell an Isaac Asimov sci-fi short story like you can tell a joke. Like it's that much of a kernel of an idea that you can just like say it. Um, and then Ray Bradbury, who definitely that's like probably the most influential in my childhood because
Oh.
he's got that whole Midwestern thing going on, with both like nostalgic, dreamy Midwestern, but also he sees this really real creepiness in it and this underbelly to it, this kind of
Yeah.
Lynchian vision. And he and so like something wicked this way comes, or dandelion wine,
Yep.
Fahrenheit 451, but basically definitely those first two and all of his short stories. Like I think the ultimate Ray Bradbury short story is one where the third expedition, like they go to Mars in the Martian Chronicles. It's one of the expeditions, and they get there, and it's exactly like a small town in Ohio in
Right. Yeah.
1928.
Yeah.
But the aliens just like made themselves look like that to trick the astronauts. Once all the astronauts are asleep, they butcher them in their beds. But then the creepiest part is that the aliens don't go back to being aliens right away. They kind of play at being Midwesterners a little while longer, and they have a parade down the
Yeah.
street, but slowly turning back into aliens, but then coming back. I was like, that he loves the Midwest and has this nostalgia for it, but he it it's permissible because also he feels this creepiness when he's got those two in tension. That's when he's at his very best. Definitely Bradbury was like ruled me in like junior high, and then I was like, I'm a science fiction guy. I'm reading science fiction, and then I eventually read 1984 and Brave New World in high school, and I was like, oh, what else have these science fiction writers written? Of course, not science fiction at all, and that was
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
my reading all of Orwell and Huxley I could get my hands on in high school opened me up to like real 20th century literature, or like and I was able to, I was getting into Graham Greene, and I was getting into the, Flannery O'Connor. I was getting into Camus. I was getting all these things in high school,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then in college, I I had a professor, and he said, I would like, for my freshman seminar, I said, I like you. I'm going to invite you to take my upper level class on James Joyce. It's like, great. I took a class that was just one semester of nothing but Ulysses. That was great, and it ruined me as a writer for years. Because you can never, there's
Right.
no touching that. And
Yeah.
if you're going to try to imitate it, you're lost. And so and I was studying physics at the time anyway. I didn't think I was going to be a writer. I could do a little bit of writing on the side, but not much and not very well. And I think I was kind of shut down by Joyce for a while, just because of the magnitude of the achievement. I could not even creatively misread him. He was just too huge and too great. But then also in college, I got into Evelyn Waugh, who was kind
Okay.
of
Yeah.
my doll as an adult. The
Yeah.
guy who
That's a
was
good way.
viciously
Yeah.
funny in a way that didn't feel allowed. And it kind of and so and then like after I graduated, then I kind of found those similar doll-like pleasures in like John Kennedy Toole, like Confederacy of Dunces. Like I always love a funny book.
Yeah.
And I like to put like some humor in my books, like even in the most serious or weird parts, I want to have like some social comedy and some awkwardness and some funny bits. And then I think when it was about 26, I read Man Who Was Thursday for the first time, and that kind of set me like that. Like, oh, I can do something like this. This is something I can creatively misread, and that's what led directly to The Order of Oddfish. And then nowadays, what I read is kind of like, I like Ted Chiang. He writes great,
Okay.
science
Yeah.
fiction. It kind of like feels like, in a way, it feels like Asimov is like each of his short stories is a tight joke. Like, oh, we're actually going to build the Tower of Babel and touch the sky, or okay, here's some aliens that I mean, or the Arrival, I think is a great, movie and short story of your life. And like China Miéville, I like normal stuff like Sally Rooney. But the most and one of the things that I found really inspiring for Dare to Know was Philip Pullman in
Okay.
his Dark Materials books has this idea of dust, right? Which
Right.
is
Right.
these subatomic particles that are, the material evidence of original sin. I was like, oh, I can take my physics stuff and do philosophical stuff with it in this way, and you can get away with it. Like, and I was like, how is he getting away with this in a YA book, in a children's book? And of course, it was during this boom time when Harry Potter had come out, and they're like, we'll put out anything. So they put out these things that like would never get put out today. That like, oh, what's his Dark Materials about? Like, the Golden Compass and all this stuff. Well, it's about these two kids who kill God. It would never fly today.
Yeah.
And so but like, and also like lately, the three body problem and those the books that
Okay.
followed it by Chin Liu,
Yeah.
he's got like weird subatomic particles, the sophons that are that are like surveillance particles that you can never get away from. And so that idea of like taking physics and being able to do philosophical things with it in your fiction is like, oh, I can fake talking like that. So that's kind of where the idea of where thanatons, the death particle
Right.
from Dare to
Right.
Know. And but the most I'm leading all the way up to the most important writer,
Oh,
not a fiction writer.
okay.
It's René Girard. That
Really? Okay.
yes. Um, his so I know that now his there's a stink around his name because Peter Thiel really liked him,
Right.
and Peter Thiel was one of his students at Stanford. But I remember when I was writing my first novel and I was like hanging out at Borders, which this is what ages me, and I saw the cover of um, Violence and the Sacred, this really stark cover, and I like picked it up and I started reading it, and I was absolutely entranced. I mean,
Yeah. Well,
I studied physics and philosophy in college,
I
but
mean,
I
the subtitle of Bride of the Tornado is "Survival Demands a or Requires a
yes.
Sacrifice." So that makes total sense.
Yes, and so this idea of in all three of my books, the idea of like there's a cycle that of like kind of the in Rene Girard for those people who and you correct me if I'm wrong, this might be my misreading of him, but you have communities that come together because of the collective violence against an innocent victim, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And like, we see this like people say, how is that true? It's like, well, you see it playing out online all the time. On Twitter, there's always like a character of the week that everybody decides they're all going to jump on it. And that's how you get like the social solidarity of Twitter. Like everybody decides this one person, we're all going to beat up on them. They are going to die now. And of course, Girard has this twist to it. It's like, well, in the way that Christianity is different is because it's the first time that this story is told from the point of view of the victim, of Jesus.
Yeah.
And he breaks this cycle. And that kind of starts up the whole like Western tradition of like uh, of of stories is that they have this, according to Girard, I don't know if this is true, that this novelty of the cycle of violence and reprisal that's solved by the killing of an innocent victim who's both in the community and not in the community is given a twist by telling from the point of view of the victim. And so in Dare to Know, there is a cycle, a metaphysical cycle that is going on of the world
Right.
having to be refreshed every once in a while by this massive sacrifice, and but this world like wants to stop existing, but it has to keep getting refreshed, and but that cycle is broken by the innocent victim, the main character, or not so innocent. He's not such a great guy.
Yeah.
Bride of the Tornado, there is these tornadoes that kind of have this cycle with the small town that they surround and they kind of are parasitic on and are fascinated by, but they destroy, and this kind of biological cycle there is disrupted by the innocent victim. And it's the same thing in The Order of Oddfish. There is a person who comes into this city and she is the one who is foretold to be the destroyer of the city. Nobody knows that that is her, and she disrupts the cycle. I found his ideas like so clarifying about what stories are about, and gives a philosophical undergirding to them.
Yeah.
Um,
And the stories then don't wind up being light against dark or how the good guy had his hero's quest and everything is fine at the end and the bad guys have been eliminated. It's always left with devastation, and then the cycle begins again, and it's a little bit murkier. And when we're reviewing a book, and this is something that you did really well in your presentations for both of these novels, Dare to Know and Bride of the Tornado, it's pretty important to avoid like massive spoilers,
mhm.
which could maybe ruin it for some people. And you know, I tend to reveal the spoilers because I'm doing an in-depth analysis of works and stuff like that. And I also kind of think that, a really good book, even if you have spoilers, you're going to go back to it and read it again. And I can say that with Dare to Know. I've read it, multiple times at this point, and I just finished Bride of the Tornado earlier, and I'm going to go back to it again. So
Great.
you avoid spoilers when you're doing, author meets people at bookstores and stuff like that. And I understand why, but do you think it's important to avoid giving away spoilers? It would ruin people's enjoyment of the works.
No, it's not important at all. I think it's fine to spoil everything. I
Okay.
mean, when we were selling Dare to Know, like the original idea was like, oh, it's about this company that could tell the time and date that you die. And I was like saying, oh, but the real twist is it's the salesman. He looks himself up and he's already dead. And I said, that's the twist. And the marketing people said, no, that's the hook.
Okay.
um, that's just going to get people to buy it. And so, I think it's it. What you need to have is an idea that puts butts in seats. And once the person is reading your book, it kind of doesn't matter how they got there because the pleasures that you're going to, I mean, that the kind of pleasures that I want to give in my books are not those kind of plotty, pacey pleasures. Like
Yeah.
my books are more ruminative and philosophical and kind of voicey. And so when you're coming to one of my books, it's not what's going to happen next and oh, don't ruin it for me.
Or who
So
committed the
yeah,
murder or something like that.
yeah. Like oh no, Leland Palmer killed his daughter. Uh, um,
Yeah. Well, I was
sorry if that
thinking,
spoils it for people, but it's like 30 years later, so you can't complain.
yeah, I was thinking like, we still go back and read H.P. Lovecraft stories or Philip K. Dick stories, even
Mhm.
though we know exactly what's going to happen. It's not like, we pick up the book and shake it a bit and suddenly, the plot changes or something like that.
And we want to
So,
have something that's rereadable. And I think something that
mm,
whose pleasures rely too much on what's going to happen next.
yeah,
If
yeah.
you're spending all your time trying to engineer that, that might not be the most rereadable book.
Moving
Can I
on.
go back for a second? What you're
Yeah.
talking about plotty stuff. Here's the book that kind of broke it wide open for me. And was both, I don't think I would want to spoil it for somebody, but I reread this book so many times. G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Is Thursday.
Oh,
Have you
yeah,
read this
yeah.
book?
Oh, yeah, many times. Yeah, it's a real favorite of mine. I discovered it while I was in grad school.
Yeah. It sent me on a G.K. Chesterton tear, and I read like everything I could by him. This is like 1999 or so. And I actually I was on another podcast just talking about The Man Who Is Thursday like a couple months ago. Just like they said, talk about Man Who Is Thursday for an hour. So I'm not going to go into it too much, but it would be bad sportsmanship to tell somebody the central twist or joke of The Man Who Is Thursday, of like the identities of all the different people on the council, right?
Right. Yeah.
But it is a very metaphysical book, and the things that you get out of it when you read it again and again are not the pleasures of plot. However, like I would never want to rob somebody of that first experience of reading The Man Who Is Thursday and getting caught up in those twists. And I guess we can't by me saying this, we can't talk too much about The Man Who Is Thursday in case your listeners haven't read it. But go read it. It's very short. It'll take
Yeah.
you a brief Saturday afternoon to read, and it's so rewarding. I think it's a metaphysical book, a book that has an argument to make, which you don't often see, like a book that has an argument to make. Like so often you read things and they're kind of written in like the kind of like this kind of like consensus tone
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
of the literary tone. And G.K. Chesterton wants to fight about something. He's got something that is not consensus that he wants to convince you about. And I agree with him, but it is on a lot of it. But it's exhilarating when somebody has a contentious point to make. And I don't know, I don't think that and I think that comes down to voice of the narrator. And I definitely love something that has a strong voice. And I feel that both Bride of Tornado and Dare to Know are very voicey books. But I wonder if I have it in me one day to write like an argumentative book, the way G.K. Chesterton did, or frankly, when C.S. Lewis would write something, he
Yeah.
always was spoiling for a fight. And that's, I mean, even though I always disagreed with him, I found him addictive because he was trying to convince me of something.
With both of James Kennedy's novels, you can say that what orients it, at least as far as us, the reader, following along in the ride with the main character, is a big what if. Now, there's more than one what if encoded or worked into these, but you can identify a key what if in each of them, at least at the start. And so in Dare to Know, it has to do with the question, do you dare to know when your own death is going to come? And then if that could be predicted, how would that actually take place? And who would be in charge of this? And as we see, it's set in America, so it quickly turns into a business model, a startup, and this is how the story, you could say, unfolds. And if we're thinking about world building, the construct of a narrative universe in weird fiction, it's oriented around these, whatever you want to call them, hypotheticals, what ifs, counterfactuals. And so let's start exploring the, rich dimensions charted out in the narrative of this one. So there's a lot to say, and obviously we're not going to touch on every single passage in the novel that has to do this, but we get the main character very, very early on talking about doing calculations for a client. He's actually meeting at a Starbucks, and he's fallen on somewhat hard times. And he says, when you have your moment, there should be a sense of occasion. Moment is capitalized. And what is a moment? Finding out when you're going to die. And he said, when we started out, when we were still sapere aude, which means dare to know, right? Coming from the famous Kant line in the What is Enlightenment essay that he wrote. It was hard for us to get taken seriously, but 100% accuracy makes the skeptics shut up. It was most satisfying when the skeptics shut up permanently, or more precisely, the time and date we predicted. Nowadays, I keep the prediction books in my car. They look like a bunch of phone directories, cheap paper packed with columns of tiny type. I keep them in the trunk along with a couple of pressed shirts and an extra suit. With no office, I have to lug the books around everywhere. But the thing is, I can't help but feel that having the books with me all the time instead of a proper bookshelf makes the whole enterprise feel low rent. We used to keep the books in a special room in the office. People mock that now, I know, but I kind of miss it. Back then, the books were leather-bound with sheepskin paper, beautiful fonts, medieval illuminations even. We'd bring them out with a kind of reverence, not grandiose, just an unfussy recognition of the seriousness of what was about to occur, like a sacrament. A priest doesn't freak out every time he makes the bread turn into God. It's just his job. He's a professional. To do the math makes the math come true. So we'd unlock the glass case and bring out the books. People always wanted to peek at what was on the pages. We showed them because why not? To expect anyone except a trained professional, it's incomprehensible anyway, just endlessly closely spaced columns of tiny numbers and symbols. Like a phone book translated into cuneiform, got infected with calculus, then mated with the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And that's what we nicknamed them, the Books of the Dead. And so, there's a whole practice going on here, which has elements of magic and elements of technology, and mathematics is involved in it, and physics as well. And then we find out that sooner or later, somebody is going to succumb to the temptation not to use this on another person, but on themselves. He writes, I remember the first time a salesman broke the taboo. The first time any of us in the company did an unauthorized assessment, it was at the first Sapere Aude conference in Minneapolis, where we started out, though to call it a conference makes it sound much more buttoned up than what actually went down at the hotel that weekend. When they made the documentary, they had referred to us as the freaks and dreamers and geniuses who started Sapere Aude. The Minneapolis conference had taken place my first year working for the company when we were just 30 employees. Really selling the time of your death is the only job I've ever had. But back then, it wasn't a real job, or didn't feel like it. The public still didn't believe or understand what we were up to. We were still cutting edge, revolutionary, punk rock, whatever you want to call it, young. We were all extraordinary. Everyone who was smart and ambitious, who knew which way the wind was blowing, wanted in. The fact they wanted me was a fluke in retrospect. Everyone in the physics community was talking about thanatons, this particle that's going to be very important. But outside academia, a lot of it was irresponsible talk. Techno-utopians claiming that controlling thanatons would grant us immortality. Hippies with their self-serving woo-woo. Religious nuts spinning their wheels trying to fit thanatons into their dogmas, right? And sort of like when people talk about quantum this or neuro this in our own time, right? So this guy is going to have, a reading of when he's going to die. And they have a little, dialogue here, and then the narrator says, you have to decide when to insist on accuracy and when to let it slide for the sake of the dinner party. And there's a discussion here about physics camp and all of that sort of stuff. And eventually, somebody is going to, find out through their own work when they're going to die. So, here we go. Back to Sapere Aude's first conference, and they're all staying up at night. Even back then, it wasn't allowed, looking yourself up. The specific taboo hadn't developed yet. It was merely against company policy. But what Blattner and Hansen didn't know wouldn't hurt them, right? And even though it'd ordinarily take hours or days to complete the calculation, we'd all drilled the algorithm so many times that week on each other, and we knew each other so well, which made anything feel possible, and we were punch drunk enough to think that if we all did the calculation together, it would be an hour's work max. And come on, when you're half in the bag in a strange city, in a strange hotel, you do things you ordinarily wouldn't. Nobody volunteered to be the subject, so like a bunch of high school dorks, we put an empty beer bottle in the middle of the table and spun it, and it landed on Hopkins, the kid, the only one in sales who was younger than Julia and me. So they go ahead and do this, right? We were all so tipsy it was a miracle any of us were able to perform the calculations on Hopkins. We were slurring the assessment, I'm sure, scrawling out the equations on pads of paper, emblazoned with the hotel's logo, pawing through our brand new books of the dead, half out of our minds. But then again, we all knew the algorithm cold at that point, knew it backward and forward. Running the assessment calculations was second nature. So they go ahead and do it. And pencils down, and Hopkins, his smile fades, and Ziegler says, 6 minutes. You're going to die in 6 minutes from now. Of course, Ziegler was the one to say it because it had to be a joke, but it was no joke. The number was correct. We'd all come up with the same result. No chance of us making the same mistake in the same way. Hopkins was going to die in 6 minutes. Not funny, guys. Come on, Hopkins said. And Ziegler and Hutchinson and the others said, no, this is the result. And, Hopkins becomes paranoid and says, maybe you'll kill me and all of that sort of stuff. And what happens? Ruptured cerebral aneurysm. Hopkins' brain exploded in his skull. It's not like we killed him, but it felt like we had. But there's a very interesting upshot. Insensitive as it was to say, from a business point of view, Hopkins' death was the best thing that could have happened to us. Kicked Sapere Aude into public consciousness. All of us swore never to reveal how we'd looked up Hopkins' death 6 minutes before he died, how we'd predicted his death to the minute. But of course, word got out. It became a kind of instant urban legend. People knew what we claimed to be selling. They knew we'd had a conference at that hotel. And the coroner's report was public record. People began to take us seriously. So, much later in the book, We're going to find out what's going on with this. Thanatons. Everyone was shocked that Thanatons behaved according to mathematics that were, now here we're going to get how the calculations are carried out, for lack of a better term, subjective. Settinger's breakthrough to acknowledge that the solver was part of the problem. That is, when solving for the Thanaton, both the problem and its solver changed. They changed each other step by step during the solving process. Even more unexpected that you could only do subjective math by inventing your own subjective way. You had to construct your own version of the math, your own version of the algorithms, your own heuristics, even your own notation. That's why computers can't do subjective mathematics. It's why Thanatons were resisted for so long by traditional mathematicians. But even open-minded mathematicians who wanted to learn subjective math had a hard time. Too difficult to break old mental habits. So young people were overrepresented at Sapere Aude. Youth is able to navigate subjective mathematics because youth isn't yet mortgaged to any worldview. Youth has nimbleness of association. Youth intuitively breaks or ignores rules. And I remember the feeling how back then it felt to me like my brain was a continuous burst of fireworks, how I could forge the most unlikely connections with a flourish, how I could ride the most zigzagging logic without being bucked off. Older mathematicians couldn't follow us into this fresh territory. It was all our own. And I do want to pause here and say something. I've experienced that myself as somebody who studied philosophy and mathematics and did a lot of work in logic and languages and things like that. When I was young, in my 20s, there's something about that freedom that Kennedy is recounting there, an experience he had as well, that is quite interesting. We find that great mathematicians and other people working in formal areas tend to be at their best quite young and then taper off as they get older, whereas in other fields where greater knowledge of the world and ability for nuance and experience plays a role, and complexity of things, sort of the difference between Pascal's esprit de géométrie, which is translated as the geometric mind, and the esprit de finesse, wrongly interpreted as the intuitive mind. This is a common pattern that is noted there, and some people are actually able to manage both. Coming back to this, each of us had to construct our own metaphor in order to visualize Thanaton mechanics. This personal metaphor helped you feel the shape of the problem, pointed the way to the solution even before you could prove it formally. Everybody's metaphor was individual, idiosyncratic. Ziegler's metaphor envisioned Thanaton theories exploring an endless living castle made of jeweled flesh. Kulkarni's put it in terms of an infinity of interlocking glass boxes with ever-shifting panes. Huang imagined snake-like creatures swimming through vast underwater jungles. For me, Thanaton theory was more like the twists, reversals, and corkscrews of an inexhaustibly complicated fairy tale, a sprawling myth that might take the entire age of the universe to fully tell, expressed through the archetypes of princesses and goblins and kingdoms, each trope charged with precise mathematical meaning, though more digressive and dreamlike than any story someone would actually narrate. The metaphor only lasted for the first few weeks. After that initial burst of creative vision, our surreal metaphors settled down, became more abstract, reduced themselves into codes of written symbols. So this is quite an interesting feature as well, isn't it? Going on, he talks about teaching Julia the algorithm, and here, this is going back into the past again, they both decide to calculate each other's death date, and they carry out the equation almost to the end, and then seal those up in envelopes. And the plan was she'd calculate my death date, in turn I'd calculate hers. We wouldn't tell each other what we'd learned. We would give the envelopes to each other. There was something about the project that was thrilling for Julia, discovery in her eyes, something novel, weird, more interesting than whatever horseshit they teach you in business school, I'm sure, right? And we find out earlier in the novel that the main character has used the books to calculate his own death date. So he shows up later in the present of the novel and meets up with Julia, who they broke up a long time ago. She's now married. She has children. And, they're hanging around for a while. And then they're going to finally get to the key thing about the envelopes. And she says to him, you said you'd already looked yourself up. Then you already know when you know. She's holding out my envelope to me. I don't take it. You open it, irritated now. I don't want to know when you'll die. Please, Julia frowns. But she does it. She opens my envelope. She unfolds the paper inside. One last multiplication to go. Just like me, she'd left that final step undone. Didn't go all the way. She takes out her phone, turns it on. She does the arithmetic on the calculator app. She stops. She calculates it again, stops again. She stares at me. Julia had looked at me like a dead man, knowing I was dead or quasi-dead. Dead as far as the Thanatons were concerned. Well, whatever death stuff was on me, she wanted it away from her house, away from her kids, away from Keith, out of her world. So it's true, she said. So what is true? She didn't say. She just said, you should go. So now we've got sort of two confirmations that the narrator is, or should be, dead. We find out almost at the very end of the novel, where he's going to the headquarters and about to get himself fired, actually, at the end of a career that has been in decline. There's Ron Wolfe, and he says, looking yourself up is already sufficient cause for termination, right? And the narrator says, the algorithm said I was dead. Ron Wolfe just nods maddeningly, but I'm talking to you, right? So there must be something wrong with the algorithm. I mean, I'm standing here, right here. Of course, I'm not standing right here. I'm still crouched on the floor with my phone. Okay, now I'm standing right here. Sit down, says Ron Wolfe. I sit in the chair. Ron Wolfe does not sit. There's nothing wrong with the algorithm. But listen, stop, interrupts Ron Wolfe. Yeah, the algorithm predicts when you're going to die, and the algorithm can also predict when you're going to look yourself up. Takes a second for this to sink in. Ron Wolfe, with maximum condescension. The time of your death that you derive from those books, we seeded that result in there, okay? 7:06 p.m. Central Standard Time 2 nights ago. Yeah, I know it too. That's not actually the time you were going to die. It's the time we knew you'd be dumb enough to look yourself up. You didn't get the joke? Our message to you that we knew what you were up to? It's a courtesy we throw in for every asshole who looks themselves up, ever since that stunt with Hopkins. And you're not the first one. Anyway, you're busted, and now you're fired. On the plus side, though, you're not dead, so you got that going for you. And then the narrator thinks, but wait, if the books of the dead were seeded with inaccurate information, and if they can predict more than just my death, if they can predict when I look myself up, I'm the eschaton, I say weakly. Ron Wolfe chuckles. What? Holy shit, I'm a fool. Everything I thought I discovered last night, the galactic scale of its stupidity, all comes crashing through me. There is no eschaton. There is no anti-eschaton walking around either. I'm a fool. But I know Thanaton theory. I know it better than Ron Wolfe. I sure as hell know it better than all the posers in this building, suffused with brain-melting math static they're too stupid to be bothered by. Doesn't matter. I was wrong, and now I'm fired with less than $10 to my name. Ron Wolfe opens up a drawer in the desk. It has a paper in it folded up. Ron Wolfe places the paper on the desk between us. This is your real death. The paper sits there. Don't reach for that paper, but I want it. I want it at this moment. I want my death so badly. I realize that up until now, I never truly understood the appeal of what we sell. But now that my death has become real, now that my own calculation is complete, now that my death has been forced out of an unmeasured cloud of possibilities and pinned to one definite date, I want that paper more than anything. Right? And I'm going to leave it there. You get a sense of how central, how important this is to people. And there's an entire industry out there dealing with this. Some trying to use computers, which doesn't really work. Others claiming to provide how you're going to die, but with, getting less accurate about when you're actually going to die. And then one other thing that's mentioned in here, there's a philosophical question that doesn't get answered, but does get answered in the novel, not by the books or calculations. Why are you going to die? The what if that orients the world in Bride of the Tornado is, of course, going to be different than that in Dare to Know, but it's different not just in setting or the characters involved, but in where the premise is going to lead. And you could say that there's really a triple part to this what if. So what if tornadoes were actually sentient? If they weren't mere weather phenomena, but they wanted things, they did things, they had memories, they had intention. So that's one part of it. And then what if there was somebody who would step up and fight the tornadoes, who would, in fact, kill the tornadoes, and he's called the Tornado Killer. And he's a sort of scapegoat character. He has to live outside of town. He's also, in some degrees, ascetic. He can't be besmirched or weakened by being touched, let alone having sex, as he's going to do in the story. Otherwise, he loses his powers and the tornadoes will get the best of him. And what if the story wasn't directly about or told through the eyes of the tornadoes or the tornado killer, but a third character, the unnamed girl who is growing up in Bride of the Tornado? So we begin at the very start in the first sentence. They called it Tornado Day, but none of us knew what it was about, us being kids. Mom and Dad wouldn't tell us, neither would our teachers. I never remembered having a tornado day before, and neither did Cecilia or any of our friends or anyone at school. All that week leading up to Tornado Day, Mom and Dad didn't let us eat much. I wasn't even supposed to feed Nikki, her kitten. Breakfast was like one piece of dry toast, lunch was a hard-boiled egg, dinner was nothing, right? And then what is Tornado Day? We're going to find out that the tornado killer is going to come to school. And he's giving a speech. There's sort of a ritual involved. People are making fun of him. And then tornadoes come and attack the school and start breaking the place up. And we see the tornado killer in action. The tornado blasted towards him. The ringing in my ears had receded enough I could hear the little kids crying and the teachers shouting. The tornado killer was about to get shredded. Someone should have helped him. Nobody did. I stared at the tornado killer. This boy was all there was between us and this monstrous spinning funnel roaring out of the darkness. The tornado killer stirred. Other kids looked away. As unpopular as he'd made himself, nobody wanted to see what they all knew would happen next. What would happen to all of us? We were wrong. The tornado killer raised his head from the dirt. Shakily, he lifted his left hand. The air changed. The tornado staggered back, still swirling but woozily swaying, dipping back and forth, and the tornado killer leaped up. Keeping his left hand raised, he sliced his right hand through the air. The tornado reeled, and there's essentially a fight scene here, and he beats the tornado. And now we know what the tornado killer is really supposed to be about. And there's a little bit more description here that I want to bring up. This is in the next chapter. She says, I grew up here in the middle of what you'd call nowhere. There really isn't any other town for miles, just a highway and cornfield and Midwestern plains. Sometimes when I'd see our one bus station out near the edge of town, I'd think about what would happen if I got on a random bus and left. Don't tell anyone. Nobody was stopping me. I'd never been out of town, not even for vacation. It's not like I hated home, though. I didn't hate my family. I didn't hate my life. But waking up in the middle of the night sweating, why did I feel so panicked, short of breath? I didn't know why. What was wrong with me? Then I met the tornado killer. So the tornado killer is going to be this absolutely central feature in this girl's life. And there's a lot of back and forth that I'm going to skip over just in interest of time, and so you can read it yourself. But I will say this. There's a very interesting discussion here about the library. I was there, she says, to research the tornado killer. I mean, there had to be something about tornado killers at the library, I thought, if tornado killers had always been around town, like people said. I looked in the periodical section for old newspaper articles about tornado killers or reports of when tornadoes had hit town or how much damage the tornadoes had done. There wasn't much. But I noticed that some issues of the newspaper were missing, or pages from them, around the time that storms had happened, as though someone had removed them. I flipped through the card catalog drawers. There were a handful of locally published books about the tornado killer and some materials in their special collections, but all these books were checked out. I said to the librarian, "Who checked out all the books about the tornado killer?" "I can't tell you who he is," tutted the librarian, but not unkindly. "Are you doing research for a project?" Or she let the rest of the question hang there and looked at me funny. No, I felt uncomfortable the way the librarian was looking at me. She wore one of those ugly necklaces like Mrs. Bindley's. The librarian noticed me looking at the necklace and gave me a strange smile as if we were both in on the same joke. Of course, it wasn't so weird all those books were checked out. The tornado killer was big news. People naturally wanted to learn more, but the librarian had said, "I can't tell you who he is," as though there was just one guy who checked out all the books himself all at once. Who then? I said, "The card catalog says you have other stuff about the tornado killer in a special collection." "The special collection is closed while we restore the materials," the librarian indicated behind her. There was a window into a staff-only back room. Laid out on a table were a bunch of colorful note cards, torn and dirty. So they're keeping things kind of under wraps. And what we're going to find out is, kids being kids, they're going to go outside of the confines of the town where it's safe to the tornado killer's own house, where they party and create some problems. But she winds up with the tornado killer. The van is sucked up into the sky as she is driving, and there is the tornado killer in the clouds, watching me, floating only a few yards away. Green and blue eyes, that unfriendly look, but not an unfriendly look, more like he couldn't believe it, like I was the one who was cornering him. And like he was in over his head. And what ends up happening, not described in any great erotic detail, but they wind up together, kissing, and then having sex. We went on kissing until we were out of the whiteness and into the open, and the clouds spread below us like a map of heaven. And what ends up happening is this, sort of like Samson losing his hair, the tornado killer loses his powers, or is weakened, enough that the tornadoes seem to do him in. But it turns out the tornado killer isn't dead. And we see our character interacting with him together in this house that has survived all the, damage and things like that. And they go, it's Archie's old house. The tornado killer was in bad shape, worse than I'd thought, scraped, cut, bleeding all over. There was a chunk taken out of his side and a long, deep gash up his leg. I'd seen the tornado killer's body. I knew this body. It wasn't the same body. It was a wreck of scrambled meat. He doesn't even know who she is at first. She won't let him die. He was mostly unconscious at this point, but he flinched every time I touched him as if I was hurting him. I tried to feed him old canned soup I found in the kitchen. Even if I managed to get the food in his mouth, most of it trickled down his chin. His body was just an object, a leaky slab of flesh, and he didn't know me. Maybe I wasn't the only girl the tornado killer had taken into the clouds. Maybe I was one of many girls. All right? And so eventually he recovers. And we find that the tornado killer and her are connected together in a very interesting way. He can see her memories. She can share in his memories. She finds out what he's gone through. It was a pretty terrible childhood, being prepped to go out and fight tornadoes, not knowing whether he's going to survive or not, by Mr. Z, who's one of the other characters, an old man who's very tough and lives in town and does things to the girls of the town with the parents knowing that changes them somehow. We read, I broke away from the tornado killer. I was so close to him, lying next to him, almost but not quite touching in Archie's dark, strange house. The tornado killer lay back, exhausted, his eyes closed. He didn't say anything. I was wide awake, wide-eyed, exhilarated. The tornado killer had been in my head. He had lived my memories. He had been me. I had lived his memories too. I had been him too. And when the tornado killer turned back to me, when he looked at me again, I felt it all starting over. I was falling into his eyes. I thought I wasn't ready, but then I was. I wanted to do it, even if the tornado killer saw something embarrassing about me. I didn't care. I wanted to show him everything, especially the embarrassing stuff. I wanted to let him inside. What are you? I said. And then we have this line. It is something to be truly and totally seen. So, it's gone from being just we could call it a supernatural weird tale to in some ways a love story and a depiction of intimacy. Now, I'm going to read you one other thing from this, and then we'll sort of finish up with this part and go back to some of the Kennedy interviews. The tornado killer was awake. He was awake. He knew me now. He could move, but not much. He couldn't walk. I managed to put clothes on him from Archie's closet. He looked up at me grateful. He couldn't speak more than a few words or it would rip up his throat. We spent most of our time in each other's memories anyway. I went along with him killing tornadoes. I walked with him on the deserted prairie at night, and he inserted himself in my memories too, playing video games with me at the bowling alley, exploring the storm drains with me. We were colonizing each other's past. We were making it like we'd always known each other. We'd always known each other. We were each other's secret, each other's hidden half. Still, we couldn't touch when we were awake. If I touched him, then he'd lose whatever little tornado-killing power he had. As long as we didn't touch, his tornado killer powers were slowly building back up. And once the tornado killer was strong enough, once he could kill tornadoes again, then we could do what I'd planned to do in the first place, except we'd do it together. We'd go to my old house, grab the keys to my parents' car, and we'd leave town. He needed to be able to kill some tornadoes for us to pull it off, so he had to rest up to rebuild. But once we were far away from here, he'd never have to kill another tornado again. And so I won't tell you how this ends, but we see that the what if has now transformed into other what ifs, and it's showing us not just the landscape of the town and the surrounding areas, but of each other's pasts. Sort of like we enter into the minds of the characters in The Bride of the Tornado and in Dare to Know. And I was wondering, how do you, as an author, relate to your characters? Sometimes you see authors saying, ooh, I love my characters, or they speak to me, or things like that. How does it work for you as a writer?
I just pour myself into them.
Okay.
I have them. Everybody is a multitude, right? And so there is like a very shitty version of me, like the main character of Dare to Know. And there is like a yearning, kind of alienated adolescent. Like, even though it's a girl, like that is like how I was in Bride of the Tornado. Like, I just like shamelessly just crib from my own life and pour stuff in there. And sometimes I'll reverse something, or I was like, well, this is exactly the thing I wouldn't do,
Yeah.
But I mean, there are so many things in both the books that are just things that happen to me, and I'll just put them in. There's a scene in Dare to Know, which the main character is having sex with his girlfriend, and he has a nosebleed on her. And he looks down at her, and her face is all bloody, and he doesn't realize why, and he like screams and freaks out. That happened to me. The kid, and I was like, when it was happening, I was like, God, this would be great for a book someday. I'm going to keep this. And it plays out differently in the book than it did in real life. But like in both of them, there's feelings that I've had, or like some things that maybe in some cases like, oh, I'll keep this to myself, but maybe I'll give this to a character one day
Yeah,
who,
yeah.
and it'll be allowable to say it because I could just say, oh, I just wrote this asshole, oh, I would never think that. Maybe I do think that though. Um, yeah, I just, and I think, okay, I don't really think this, but in the same spirit of like, Walter Benjamin saying if there's something is handcrafted, it has a kind of spirit on it that
Yeah.
like something machine made doesn't have, even if they look identical, like I think if you put parts of yourself, your honest self, into the work of art, then you will get the attention of the god and it will favor you. It will come and it will inhabit your book.
Yeah.
But there's no way to fake it. You have to make that sacrifice of your own self, and you have like Sauron forging the ring or whatever. He's putting himself into it,
Yeah.
and when the ring is broken, he's broken. And I think that's how Lord of the Rings works. But like
It is,
or,
yeah.
you've got to you must sacrifice aspects of yourself to it and for it to succeed or for it to succeed on my terms. Like my books are not, let's be honest, they're not that successful. Like, not many people read them. They're not on the bestseller list or whatever like that, but they are exactly the way I want them to be. And the only reason they're the way that I
Mm.
want them to be is because like I have put myself in them in that way that is not, doesn't feel like a genre exercise.
Yeah, that's a great explanation, I think. I mean, that term honest was the thing that really stuck out to me. You have to put your honest self, and this goes back to that question of identity. How do you figure out who the hell you are? And you said, well, a person's a multitude, and there's we're also our connections to other people in the community. So it's not as if there's like a checklist of, oh yeah, I've got it, I put all these things in, now I've got my exact honest self. It's going to be something that not to romanticize it, requires you to dig deep into who you are and bring out memories and think about what you want to present. And then there is a certain vulnerability, like you mentioned Soren and the ring, not that we want to model ourselves after him, the big baddie, but once you actually put something out there in writing and people can pick it up and look at it, especially if they know that it contains something of you, they could be quite mean about
Yeah.
it. So yeah.
But like, I think the only way that I can screw up my courage to do it is to be romantic about it and
Yeah.
not say like, by doing this, like psychologically, that will cost me. I have to think of it in terms of the God will pay attention to me and come and live in my book. Like this spirit will favor me. And that's the only way I can, even though like I don't really, my heart of hearts believe that, I have to think that during the moment.
Okay. Ask you, but you mentioned that there's this metaphysical dimension. And I think that another one of the key themes that I see in both of these stories is that of identity, of
Mm.
figuring out, not just on a cosmic scale, what the hell is actually happening here, but who am I? And both of so the characters are quite different. One is a young adolescent girl who never, until the very end, gets out of her town, apparently. And then you've got this guy who's kind of jaded, middle-aged. He's been all over the place. And in the story, he does travel around. He goes out to California, right? So he's not bound to one single place. But both of them are trying to figure out what the hell's going on with me. And I think it's done in a very good way. You know,
Thank you.
there's nothing kind of, what would you call it, like schlockily YA about it, coming of age, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
more like these characters really do need to figure out who the hell they are and what's going on. And so that seems to be another key metaphysical theme that you've woven in here.
Yes, I think we can never ask ourselves, who am I? Because you're only yourself in relation to the things around you and the
Yeah.
communities that you're part of and the cycles that you're caught up in that you might not even understand. And the overlapping communities that have different claims on you. that you define yourselves through that. Like I was thinking about this the other day about Alasdair MacIntyre's virtue ethics, right?
Okay. Yeah,
And he
yeah.
talks about like, hey, this is a philosophy podcast. We can talk about this shit, right?
Oh
I
yeah,
talk about
yeah.
this stuff other places. People don't want to hear about it, so I get to talk about it with you. Alasdair
Do they shut
MacIntyre,
you down when you bring up stuff like that, or do
they
they
just
just
their eyes. I see the
they
fire
glaze
in
over?
their eyes.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
you get excited. So this is why I like talking to you. But Alasdair MacIntyre actually taught at my university. I never took a class with him at University of Notre Dame, but and so he has this idea of like, okay, ethics isn't like a Kantian thing where there's a bunch of rules you have to follow, and nor is it an idea of like it's our emotions that guide us or some kind of intuition.
Yeah.
But we are part of these virtue communities that have certain claims on us, and we have excellences that we're trying to gain, and we are judged by the people, and we do things to gain virtue in these communities. I mean, that's broadly it, right?
Right,
And then,
right.
but there's also I find what stories are good at is showing the differing claims of overlapping communities that have different claims on you. So the most puerile way I can put it is like Star Wars. Luke has like the claims of the Jedi, like in Empire Strikes Back, like he's like, I have to go save my friends in Cloud City, and Ben and Yoda are saying you can't do that, because the claims of the Jedi, so you have to finish your training,
Yeah, yeah.
and then he said, but I have the claims of this other community that of my friends and being loyal to them, and you have once you, it's not. I think it's uninteresting when it's just like a person is a monad in which they are having just these self-contained dramas. Your dramas are always relational with the communities that have claims on you and you have staked a claim in.
Yeah.
And so in both of my books that we're talking about today, Dare to Know and Bride of Tornado, we have somebody who is part of the community but not part of the community. In both cases, they're kind of like loners. They're both
Right, right.
alienated from that community. That the community has a claim on them, and they want to be, to have a stake in it, but they just can't manage to. And they have and so there's kind of, and we feel the pull of competing like things. So anyway,
Yeah.
what when we were talking about identity, I guess what I wanted to talk about is like, you ever see the movie Upstream Color by Shane Carruth?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so he's a guy who did the movie Primer, like the most elaborate and like confusing like time travel story ever. Like you need a Shane Carruth Upstream Color. Just go check it out. But what it is about, it's basically about the life cycle of a certain entity that moves from like plants to like worms to people to pigs and back around again. And in each cycle, people are doing things, interacting with the cycle and keeping it going, but they don't know what's going on in any other thing. And they're doing things that they don't understand why they're doing it,
Okay.
but it's only understandable in the context of this whole cycle that you are watching as the viewer, and maybe you only get after the fifth time watching it. And it's about the breaking of a cycle. Like some people come to understand the totality of the cycle and how it's not good for them, and they break it. And I love stories about cycles that get broken, not cycles that like somehow keep rolling on,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that get broken in a way. And that is there's a problem with storytelling is that everybody wants to do the hero's journey. And there are
Right.
many different ways to tell a story. You can do like hero's journey is just basically like a rise, but you can do a rise and fall story, but you can also do there's a cycle and it's broken story. Like you're looking at an ant farm and then you shake it up and you watch how it all scatters.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
2001: A Space Odyssey. That's not a hero's journey. It's a cycle of like, oh, here's humanity getting into tools, and then we cut to, okay, now they've got the ultimate tool, the HAL, and they're kind of breaking away from that and like leaving tools behind and becoming something else. It's like the breaking of a cycle of tools. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
but like in this, when you say who am I, the problem with these characters and the problem with us in life is that we are all part of cycles and environments that we do not understand, and we do things we don't know why we do them, and it's like the wind like blows across a field of grass and all the grass like bows down. If you asked an individual blade of grass, why did you do that? It would say, well, I felt like bowing down. but it's not why.
Yeah, yeah.
It's because the wind is over it, and I think a lot of us, we do not understand who we are, what we are doing, what gigantic structures we are involved in, and what systems we're part of. And so I want to give that kind of feeling to the characters, and then you can have the pleasure of, figuring out what that system is and having it revealed to you in the book. But I don't like to reveal it too much. I like to and I think some people are like, they don't. I want to give you the pleasure of teasing it out. Like at the end of like Twin Peaks,
Yeah.
people are arguing about it even today. Like what really happened there? People have theories, stuff like that, and I like an ending like that. But some people don't like that. When you have an explanation, it's a balance. Some people want things to be explained. Some people like don't spell it out too much.
Well, that's a good point. So without giving away too many spoilers, I think that having read these two works, I can say that the endings are pretty ambiguous in ways that probably will frustrate somebody. They'll be like, what happened next? This theme that James Kennedy has identified as involved in his works, that uniting identity, community, metaphysics, sacrifice, cycles, is really present in both of them. And I'm actually going to begin with it in Bride of the Tornado rather than Dare to Know, because I've already started out with Dare to Know first and given that a lot of play. So in Bride of the Tornado, there's something going on in this town, and it is set all in this one town. There's references to outside places, which the narrator has never gone to, but thinks to perhaps escape towards by going to the bus station and taking a bus. And what she finds are little symbols. It says, I had a private mystery I was trying to solve. Now, this private mystery is actually going to be not so private because it's going to involve the entire town. Sometimes in little hidden places around town, I would see a strange symbol. Once I discovered the symbol, I began to notice it in other places or different versions of it. I'd happen upon it unexpectedly. It would be carved into a tree or written in the margin of a textbook, spray painted under a bridge. And although there were variations, there were always four parts that looked like the diagram of a flower, or the features of an alien face, or the sketch of a biological system, or something obscene. Kind of big rounded figure above, a similar rounded figure with something inside it below. Coming out of them on the sides, two arcing pipes of unequal length, both ending with a kind of knob or cap or circle. I didn't talk about this with anyone. I didn't want anyone else to know about it. I wanted it to be a private puzzle. Only I was invited to understand. As it's going to turn out, we'll find these playing a role later on. But I want to read another thing to you where, it's starting to open up, right? And she's reading through these cards that she's snuck in, and they're the speech that was given by the tornado killer. And she said, I read and reread them. It felt unpleasant. It put me in the mood of church stuff. Mom and Dad weren't religious, even though they'd both been raised in religious families. Our family didn't really go to church, except maybe for Christmas and Easter every once in a while at the big church downtown. A few years ago, Dad had some midlife spiritual crisis, and for a few months we did go to church every Sunday, and Cecilia and I had to go to Sunday school. And she says, by that time, Cecilia and I were too old for any of the teachings to take root. Since we hadn't grown up religious, we never paid attention to what people believed. It was just stuff we heard about secondhand. And so when it was actually explained to us, it made zero sense. Cecilia and I would look at each other as the Sunday school rambled on. People didn't really believe this stuff, right? Here's the secret of the world. Nobody really believes it. Not even the priest. Not really. There's a special way people talk when they're saying something they don't really believe, and you don't really believe, but you both agreed for some reason. You both pretend to believe it. That's what the stuff on the cards reminded me of. The creepy stuff our catechism teacher would recite to us in tones both complacent and anxious. And so this is the tornado killer who was giving this speech, something he didn't believe, something they didn't really believe. But there is something going on beneath this. So here's one of the other scenes. Mr. Z. Mr. Z is an old man in town, and he's going to wind up being a pretty important person for more than one reason. 12 girls in white wedding dresses stood in line outside Mr. Z's house. Their parents stood behind them, holding their daughters' shoulders. Everyone was still. The only sounds were the storm siren and Mr. Z's ringing telephone. Mr. Z's front door opened. Mr. and Mrs. Studenberger came out with Lisa Studenberger. Lisa was wearing a white dress too. Mr. and Mrs. Studenberger looked relieved, but Lisa's expression was empty, like she'd seen something that had broken her eyes. She had the same frozen smile as Melanie. So there's something going on in the town that has to do with the kids, certainly the girls, and there's all sorts of other hints, and slowly, the picture is becoming clearer and clearer. Now, they're in Lisa's basement, and we have this interesting thing going on. I was dreaming, but it didn't feel like a dream. It was Lisa's basement, but it wasn't Lisa's basement. It had the fake wooden walls and patterned carpet, but there was something different. In that basement, the tornado killer and not me were gone, disappeared beyond that new door in the wall. All the sleepover girls were lying where they were before, watching me with their empty eyes and fixed grins. I walked past them. I went to the hole in Lisa's wall. The room beyond was completely dark except for 4 people. Who are the 4 people? I'd been here before. I knew this place. The black place felt like nowhere, but I was connected to it, like a room in my own house I'd never known was there. The 4 people glowed. The tornado killer and Mr. Z faced away from each other. The third person was Mrs. Lois, an older woman who works in the diner. She stood next to me. The 4th person opposite me I couldn't look at her. Some kind of dance started. Mrs. Lois moved away from me and approached Mr. Z. She took his hands, guiding him so he was walking backward like they were doing a grave and elaborate tango. She looked deep in his eyes, a wanting look, advancing, guiding him backward towards the tornado killer. And with each backward step Mr. Z took, he was getting younger. The tornado killer was moving, too, jerkily in step with Mr. Z. Their movements connected like mutual marionettes, and as the tornado killer walked backwards towards Mr. Z, little by little he wasn't a beautiful boy anymore. His face coarsened step by step into something harsher, older. The tornado killer and Mr. Z passed each other, and at that moment they looked like two young Mr. Z's, or 2 old tornado killers. Mrs. Lois passed away from them both and past me as if I wasn't even there, disappearing into the darkness beyond me. Her part was over. So it's not a complete parallel, but Mr. Z and the tornado killer are intimately connected metaphysically in identity. Mrs. Lois is also there, but she passes on. So there's a different kind of cycle going on. I stepped into Mrs. Lois's place. She disappeared into the darkness behind me. Where had she gone? I knew if I turned around, I could see where Mrs. Lois had gone, the place where she went after I replaced her, but I didn't want to see what happened to her. I didn't want to turn around. That left me facing the other person, the 4th person staring at me across the room. I looked at her. The horrible woman radiated in the darkness, the same monstrous woman I'd seen with Archie's mother in that room waiting for me and Cecilia to come to them that snowy New Year's Eve 100 nightmares ago. She smiled and she showed me her curvy knife. This woman is going to turn out to be central as well. And we have another scene a little bit later at the church where they take the Jesus crucifix down from the altar, disassemble the cross. Something was hidden inside the hollow body of Jesus, which turns out to be all sorts of, let's call them cult artifacts. And the narrator is watching this. The horrible woman stared right at me, furious, right? And she has to flee them. And eventually we're going to find she's actually taken by them. And what happens? Well, two things. So the tornado killer and her are connected together, right? And we've got this scene here where the tornado killer has cut her with this knife. And, it's written in sort of almost like a dream sequence. And then the symbol is carved into her. But then we have something that's done in a more realistic way, although it's also rather surrealistic as well. Mr. Z is going to, as he says, make myself really small, and I'm going to go inside you, and I'm going to stay inside you until I'm ready to be born again, because you're the bride of the tornado. As he spoke, the horrible woman stepped into the hallway again, and behind her the tornadoes appeared outside the window, excitedly pressing forward, whirling around the house so close, putting us into the center of a spectral geometry, an undulating power passing from the tornadoes to the horrible woman to Mr. Z, and now Mr. Z was becoming smaller and smaller, still speaking in his voice, smaller every second, till the thing that called itself Mr. Z looked like an old man, but he was half his original size, now a quarter, now doll size, now even smaller. A naked little old man emerged from his clothes and scampered across the floor. And he goes inside her, where he is going to be gestated and born. And then we jump ahead to being inside the church. And she's been paralyzed by the black milk that comes from the horrible woman, right? And the church was full of people, but the church had changed. I was lying on the altar. I couldn't move. I tried to budge my arms and legs. Nothing happened, not even a twitch. I saw the symbol tattooed on my arm. I wanted that tattoo off me. I wanted out of here. I felt the tornado killer thinking the same thing. We synced up together for a moment, our minds brushing against each other. I tried to cling to him. I could feel him trying to hold me too. We slipped off each other. They were doing something bad to him right now too. I was helpless on the altar. And the church is overflowing with people. She can't move her arms or legs. And everybody comes up to her, and there's a sort of ceremony going on. Mr. McAllister walked up, gave the necklace, bent over, and murmured, "Bride of the tornado." Seth Dingle walked up, gave the necklace, and said, "Bride of the tornado." Everyone did it. I pleaded with my eyes. I didn't want this. They all did it anyway. Every time someone said it, Mr. Z felt a little more at home in me, and I felt more cut off. Now, she'll end up escaping in just a bit, but before that, we're going to get this vignette in the chapter called The Horrible Woman. And this is where we get the revelation of what's actually been going on. I'm nobody. I'm not me, I'm a tornado. I blow around town, I kick up dust, I twist the air and make it sing. I'm feeling good, I smash houses, I blast through trees, I pick up a car and toss it at the sky. I'm air, I'm wind, maybe I'll kill a man, rip him apart, fling up the pieces. That's me. I'm watching you. I'm jealous of you. I'm curious about all of you. I'm lonely. I'm wind. I've been here forever, blowing over empty land. And then people showed up. Who are you? Years and years and years ago, I saw the people. The people woke me up. I wondered what they were. I even wondered, what's it like to live with people, loving and hating and crying and laughing? And I wanted that too. I wanted to love, hate, cry, laugh, even though I was just wind. I wanted to be like them. I became a tornado. I gave birth to more tornadoes. I was all the tornadoes at once, thirsty for feelings, and I blew around dirt, I nudged it, I molded, and I made 3 creatures that looked like people, but they weren't people. They were just pieces of me. I made a little boy with blue and green eyes, an old man with green and blue eyes, a woman with brown eyes, all part of me, all connected to each other. Tornado energy circulating between me and them, the boy and the man fighting and pushing against me as I fought and pushed against them, making the tornado power cycle back and forth, nourishing our combination so I could feel the world through them, so I could feel the boy and the man through the woman. I'm a boy, they call me a tornado killer. I'm my own son. So this is what it's like to be a boy, to have arms and legs, to live, to be born and crawl out of another person, to run barefoot across the prairie in the morning, to be lonely and cry, to dream, to learn, to fight a tornado, to fall in love, to get old, to be an old man, a mean old man, to become a baby and born again, with a mommy who will love me, right? Will you protect me? Will you be a mommy for me? Because the boy always gets older, and what happens if he gets too old? He needs to be born again. And if I'm going to keep eating feelings, we need a human to help. We need a fourth for our little party. We need a girl to turn us from old to young. We need a bride. Are you nobody too? There's a pair of us, don't tell. And the brown-eyed woman streams the tornado killer's feelings to me. She stays the same. She never dies. She just keeps herself hidden, keeps herself swollen with death, keeps weaving her jewelry, keeps soaking in feelings, keeps streaming those feelings out to me. As my tornadoes devour feelings, my tornadoes demand more. We want that fear, love, excitement, jealousy, nervousness, shame, pride, joy of the tornado killers. And the brown-eyed woman keeps broadcasting it to us, swelling with black milk as she watches from her little window in the church. She keeps choosing girls. She keeps drinking pain. I'll live forever. I keep watching through my 6 eyes, living through my 3 bodies. I am all of them. I'll keep swirling up storms. I keep killing storms, keep getting reborn, keep gorging on luscious feelings, keep on killing. And if a tornado killer ever wants to know who he really is, why, he can just pick up the phone. I'll tell him. I'll tell anyone. I'm whispering to the phone lines all the time. I'm calling myself. I can hear myself me talking to myself. There I am. How dreary to be somebody. So she's realized that she's part of this cosmic cycle that is going on around this town that involves tornadoes, a tornado wanting to take on humanity and doing so over and over again. And then finally, here's the last part of it that I'll bring up. Cuthbert has rescued her, so to speak, and she's got this oily jar that she can drink and kill the baby that's within her. And what we read is Cuthbert says, I'm trying to get you out. And she says, it'll never let us out. It? What's it? It was me, and I was it. Pictures of its body had been scrawled over town since before I was born. I'd even drawn some of them myself. The horrible woman was the brain above. The 2 tornado killers were the arms stretching out from either side. I was the belly below, and before me, Mrs. Lois was the belly, and before her, some other girl and another girl and another girl. They always found the bride of the tornado. I stared at the jar at my feet. It felt toxic, but the thing inside me was toxic, and the tornado killer hadn't been protecting anyone. When he fought a tornado, he was just a nightmare devouring itself, giving birth to itself, circulating its nightmare energy, and now I was part of that nightmare. And this is what Mrs. Lois said to her before. You'll have to drink the whole thing if you want to clean yourself out. I couldn't touch the jar. Its stench made my head swim. And then I felt the squirming thing in my belly quickening, reaching out to search for the other parts of itself, finding the tornadoes and the horrible woman. I'm going to leave it there rather than tell you exactly how it ends. But cosmic cycle going on. We have something similar happening in Dare to Know, but not just for a town, the entire cosmos in this case. And it has to do with all sorts of things, including the Thanatons, but also a Native American settlement in the Midwest that, we know about along the Mississippi River. And we read about this early on. There used to be big Native American cities around here. Did you know that? I hadn't known. My family was taking a cross-country trip and came to Cahokia in southern Illinois, just a few hours from here. There were dozens of flat-top pyramids and earthworks and mounds. One of them is over 100 feet tall. Apparently there used to be a big city there about 1,000 years ago. They called it Cahokia. 30,000 people, and whoever planned it out were geniuses. It was all carefully engineered. The mounds and buildings laid out according to geometric and astronomical patterns, and that's without modern surveying equipment. They say thousands of people would come to this city on pilgrimages for rituals and feasts, people from all over the country, mingling and trading. It was bigger than London or Paris at the time. This is all before anyone from Europe even set foot here. Now there's nothing. Bunch of hills outside of St. Louis, most of them dug up or destroyed. Most people don't even know about it. Nobody cares. When Europeans first came across it, the city had been abandoned for centuries. We don't even know the city's real name. The Europeans called it Cahokia because that was the name of the tribe that happened to be living around here at the time. But Cahokia had lasted 5,000 years, longer than the United States, or 500 years rather, longer than the United States has been around. Someday our number will come up too, and nobody will remember our names either. Later on, this motif is going to come up again. And the narrator is remembering his friend Renard, who died. It made me think of Renard's Cahokians, of their gruesome pits full of executed men, women, and children. Maybe the Cahokians had their own Thanaton theory. Maybe human sacrifices occurred so that everyone there could feel the same unnerving correctness of intentionally killing a person at the exact moment the universe demanded it. Perhaps these Cahokians, who after all were mathematically advanced enough to design their city on a precise astrological plan, also had enough of a grasp of Thanaton theory that when the calculations decreed the time for a certain group of people to die, these people were rounded up and executed precisely when the math predicted. By making their death ceremonial and intentional, the Cahokians could be flooded with the same feeling of dreadful rightness I had experienced when watching that video, of actively working together with the universe, of reintegrating themselves into that primal truth. Right? We see again this idea coming up. And the narrator actually talks about running across that in a university lecture at one point. Now, a little bit later, they're trying to search for the flickering man. This is back when the narrator is young and Renard is still alive. And they're looking through source code. They've gone to computer camp and things like that together. And they find that the numbers 7 and 8, and to a lesser extent 6 and 9, came up with greater frequency than the others. I wrote a second program that analyzed the data in a different way and found if you analyze the numbers in the file 2 at a time as two-digit values, it revealed all the numbers were between 65 and 90. Strange. In principle, that pattern shouldn't occur because the numbers were supposed to represent graphical data of the game levels, structures of floors, bitmaps of creatures, locations of treasure. Why would data only be expressed by the numbers 65 to 90? Why nothing below 65? Why nothing above 90? Then the bell rang for me. ASCII code. ASCII is how computers encode text for internal processing. Each number from 0 to 255 corresponds to a different character. In ASCII, those numbers from 65 to 90 correspond to the uppercase alphabet. A, 65, all the way to 90Z. If these values represented letters, maybe there were words. I wrote a third program to convert the data files from ASCII codes into text. The output was disappointing. There didn't seem to be any words, no apparent pattern even. It just read like pages and pages of too much to shift through. I whipped together a fourth program to search for English words in the text. I loaded up all the words from a standard dictionary file to compare against the data file and let it rip. The computer churned for a while. When I came back to the lab, the program had finished executing. In the pages and pages of numbers, the program had found only 4 cases in which ASCII corresponded to English words. The words were all in a row. Decoded from ASCII, this corresponded to the text string, "Now you are in." Now you're in what? It was the beginning of a sentence, but whatever came next must have been nonsense because it didn't match anything in the dictionary. I decided to translate the ASCII immediately following "Now you are in" anyway. I scanned the files and found the values. 65, 67, 65, 72, 79, 75, 73, 65. Cahokia. Now you are in Cahokia. So revealed to him through technology, through mathematics, through coding, he's in Cahokia. What does that actually mean? Well, we read a little bit later in the book. On July 4th, 1054, a new star exploded out of nowhere. The explosion was so brilliant that for days its light was visible on Earth both night and day. The new star was nearly as bright as the full moon, even though it was 6,000 light years away. Arab astronomers recorded it. So did Chinese astronomers. The Japanese have accounts of it. Native American petroglyphs and the oral tradition of Aboriginal Australians mention it. The strange star lingered in the night sky for 2 years. Nowadays, we know that what Earth saw was a supernova. When the supernova ignited, Cahokia changed. According to archaeologists, around 1050, the time of the supernova, Cahokia underwent a sudden large-scale alteration. Until then, Cahokia had been a decentralized group of villages, each with its own local rituals. But starting around 1050, instead of the previous open courtyard plans, new constructions were built on a strict north-south grid. Cahokia's earthen flat-topped pyramids and plazas date from this time, including the 100-foot-tall Monk's Mound. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence, I thought, that Cahokia transformed right when a new star appeared. After all, the city plan of Cahokia was modeled on astronomical principles, including their precise, calculated wood henge of poles that track the solstices. It was around this time that the theatrical human sacrifices began, along with their days-long citywide feasts. Were the Cahokians trying to soothe an unpredictable star? Celebrate a newborn star? What were they doing? People nowadays like to think we're beyond such thinking. But what would happen if such a gargantuan new fire blazed up in our modern sky? Would people really stay calm, or would we slide down into something more desperate? How durable is civilization? How easily could things collapse if one day we looked up and saw a fiery face glaring at us from heaven? And as we go on in the novel, we read, "We're near the end of our time, aren't we? We might find out sooner than we'd like. Astronomers tell us that perfectly ordinary eruptions from the sun could demolish Earth's entire electronic network. The fatal event doesn't even have to be a solar storm. Maybe the Earth gets hit by an asteroid," and it goes on and on. And that is what is happening. The universe is drawing to a close, and it has to be renewed in some way. So much later, closer to the end of it, we read, "Everyone in this hotel will die tomorrow except me." Because the eschaton isn't a particle, it's a person. An eschaton and an anti-eschaton are born at the same time. They diverge. A universe flourishes between them. The king and the princess enter the enchanted hall. They lose each other in the dark. Dreams flourish. The king and the princess find each other again, and they leave the hill. The particles plunge back into each other and annihilate each other. The universe is annihilated too. I am the eschaton. The eschaton is not a particle. It's me. I go into the bathroom. Shaking, every particle has its antiparticle. Who is the anti-eschaton? But I already know who. Her. In the mirror I see myself, but it's not myself. Behind me the shower curtain moves. There's a ragged man behind it. And we read some more about this. And I'm going to leave you with two final passages, so I don't want to reveal quite too much. But this is what they call the Great Calculation, right? And there's a chanting going on, and centuries fall off of me. I feel her coming. Shuzi is advancing towards me, and the room floods with metallic light. Outside the window, new stars have erupted. The people gathered around the hill stare upward, and the room is tipping over, and it is tipping, it is changing. The floor becomes the ceiling becomes the floor, the walls are turning bronze, the gold multiplying on bronze, gold and bronze walls everywhere. And then we are inside the enchanted hill, surrounded by dreams and dreams of dreams. We are atop Monk's Mound, Cahokia, surrounded by people lined up to be sacrificed. Shuzi says, now we are in Cahokia. And here's the last passage that I'll read you from this. And it's kind of interesting. So there's a PowerPoint presentation that's being projected, and it says several different things. Now you drink the black drink. Now you die. Now you are in Cahokia. I am in Cahokia and San Francisco and all the holy places all at once. And there's a bunch of flickering going on. And I won't tell you exactly what ends up happening, but it's a cosmic event, a cyclical thing that's taking place. Both of these novels have that at the heart, and you would never guess it from reading the first few chapters because they're mysteries that are being revealed that have to do with metaphysics, identity, community, and circles that have to do with the great things: birth, death, sex, life, emotions, cosmology, our thoughts about that. These really are philosophical novels that Kennedy has produced. Are there more novel-length stories ahead with ideas that you're kicking around or you've been ruminating on in the way that you have that produced these two volumes?
Yes. So you'll notice that both the main characters, both those novels don't have names.
Yeah.
Or the names are never mentioned. And I'm writing another novel in which the character does not have a name. And I think these three books are going to kind of stand together as a certain thing that I'm doing.
Okay.
And they're kind of all of a piece. This one is called Let 'Em In. The general premise is that there are, starting like the late 70s, there's these silver doors that just start appearing all over the world. And you can't open them, but they just look like a kind of antique stove or something. And they just appear like in your living room or at school under the chalkboard or at the library or in the corner in the bathroom. And kids are really fascinated by them. They kind of go up to them and you knock on them, you listen to them, you hear something's happening on the other side, but you don't know what. And then little by little, like over the 80s, kids start learning how to open these doors and go into what's beyond. There's this big kind of dark labyrinth. And then the adults start finding out too and start going in. And then it gets more and more elaborate, but then the doors start appearing on people. When you open the door and go in that way, you're going this whole other like hellish dimension in which people are butchering each other and tearing each other's faces off and doing these awful things to each other, but you're addicted to it and you can't stop because you feel you have the attention of this thing that you're getting addicted to. And then at a certain point, like all the doors start locking and shutting again. You can't get in them, and some people are like locked in there and trapped forever. And then from main character point of view of this main character is like, and he's kind of going through all of this, and at the end he's like in bed with his wife and he sees on her back like there's a knocking at the door on his wife's back. It's like, what? Like and he turns the handle on the door and it starts to open. It's like this has not happened for years for anybody. And he opens it, and then the last line of that first part of the book is, and then at last it came into the world.
Oh.
And so that's part one. There's three parts. The second part is called The Last Cowboy, and it's about this kind of cult that's a combination like Manson cult and like early Apple Computer or IBM, of these people who they're called the Silver Door Company, and they're the people who do these weird rituals and things that cause the silver doors to start appearing. And the third part is like 10,000 years in the future. What this is after that thing had come and gone from the earth, and what's like left after it. And what it is, it's an emotional history of computing. It's the silver doors are basically the screens that you and I, like we started from nothing. We had these dumb terminals that didn't do anything. And then you started to be able to go into them, but only kids really cared. And they started to be able to connect, but we're carrying them on our bodies now, but we were kind of like doing these torturing things to each other and doing these kind of things that would like, the idea of like, oh yeah, I was naked on the internet is kind of like, oh, whatever now. But like only like 50 years ago, it would have been like unthinkable. You mean anybody could see you? Like it's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
changing in this weird way. And the part two is kind of like those early computer companies had a lot in common with cults. And not only that, like even now, like you go to like, the Googleplex, Google, like they do all your laundry for you. They've got childcare there. It's kind of run like a cult compound. And this California idea, there's a line you can draw from like the Manson cult out in Death Valley all the way to, Google. It's kind of two sides of the same thing of these weird, intense groups of people that get together and change everything, not really always for the better. And so, yeah, I have to have this whole thing done by December 1st.
Oh,
Um, and and I'm like halfway through the second part right now. But
okay.
this is the first time I've ever expressed this on a podcast or anything. But it's called Let 'Em In, and it's a I don't know if I've sold it or not, or if it just sounds crazy, but and I'm
I
not
think
going
it
to say what
sounds
happens
like a
in the third
great
book.
idea,
Take too much.
you
Oh,
know?
thank you. So yeah, that's the idea.
So there you have it. We've delved a bit into these two great weird novels, Dare to Know, followed by Bride of the Tornado, and had a lot of great conversation with James Kennedy. Very thoughtful stuff about these philosophical novels, where he gets his ideas from, his views on a number of matters, interspersed with my own presentation to you of these works and some of the key themes and world building that's going on within them. So I invite you to stick around. If you're watching this in the premiere, we're going to have some conversation afterwards. If you're just watching this later on, of course, you can feel free to leave comments. And, I really suggest that you get your hands on these two very recent contemporary novels. We've heard that there's a third one in this narrative universe connected to these sorts of themes, but doing some other stuff, perhaps even with a wider scope, coming up as well. And this is where we'll end for today.